On to the Dunblane murders, Martin. This was 20 years ago up in Scotland. One of the main fascinating things that fascinated me about looking into this was that there was a very accusation from one of the top Freemasons in Scotland that the guy was a paedophile, and that also that he'd received some sort of Masonic protection. That there was actually people in the police who were protecting him, and although that the official advice was that he should have his guns taken away because he was unstable, and he was also possibly procuring pictures of young boys as part of a paedophile ring, that he should be allowed to keep his gun.
Well, I understand that George Robertson, the former head of NATO, was in the same Freemasons lodge with this fellow, and had signed the firearms certificate, the character reference, which allowed him to get a shotgun, which is then, of course, he then used to kill all of those children and their teacher. Well,
there's a journalist called Marcello Mega who wrote an article about this in December 2003, and he said a top Scottish Freemason, former Grand Master Lord Burton, said that Lord Cullen's inquiry into the Dunblane massacre was an enormous cover-up, that these high-profile legal figures belonged to a secretive super-Masonic group called the Speculative Society. Anyway, it certainly doesn't look as if the real people who were responsible for this, because he certainly wasn't just acting on his own, he had some form of establishment protection, will ever be brought to book.
Well, the suspicion has to be, the copper's hunch, because obviously I haven't carried out an investigation of this, is that NATO intelligence services, don't forget Robertson ends up as the head of NATO, and it might be very handy for certain people for the head of NATO to be compromised by having paedophile connections. And I think that's the real iceberg underlying all of this VI paedophilia. The intelligence services, NATO intelligence services, the ones we've been accusing of fomenting terrorism in earlier parts of this show, have also used paedophilia as a means of blackmail. So what you do, what the suggestion is that this fellow was running, he had a boat on the Loch Lomond, he was taking senior politicians there to have sex with underage boys, all of which was being filmed by the CIA. And of course that then means that those politicians will do as they're told when they become, for example, head of NATO.
And also, of course, if any of these top politicians are closely associated with a known paedophile, that means they're easier to blackmail.
Well, indeed, and that's the point, is this isn't just random. It's not just that psychopaths at the top of the social hierarchy like having sex with underage boys and girls. It's also a strategy to dirty them all up and make sure they do as they're told. And that's what was behind the Dutroux affair in Belgium. And I think that that's what we'll find is at the bottom of the VI paedophilia scandals in this country.
Frank Cook, Labour MP for Stockton North. Cook's questions. This House notes that Thomas Hamilton, the perpetrator of the hideously distressing slaughter committed in Dunblane on the March 13, 1996, had enrolled in Lodge No. 1417 of the Masonic Order at Garrow Hill in 1977. Editor's note. It is actually numbered 1413 and its full name is Garrow Hill, Lanarkshire Middle Ward, 118 Garrow Hill Drive, Garrow Hill, Glasgow, G696NR. Lodge 1417 is actually the Jubilee Lodge in Natal, South Africa. Had been granted his firearms certificate in 1979 and had stopped attending lodge meetings in 1986. Editor's note. He was granted a firearms certificate only 2 years after he joined the Masonic Order, and it was never subsequently withdrawn despite Detective Sergeant Paul Hughes' damning warnings. That the immediate resignation of a very senior police officer's, Deputy Chief Constable Douglas McMurdo, on publication of the Cullen Report raises the question of that officer's Masonic membership. That such a senior officer of a provincial force would be unlikely not to be a Freemason. That the apparent deletion of all computer reference to Hamilton in the databanks of Central Scotland police files for the period both before and after the incident demands clear explanation. That police confiscation of the membership records of gun clubs that had disowned Hamilton in dispute of his false claims requires justification. That their continued retention is both unwarranted and inexcusable. That in all of the foregoing, the range and character of the relationship between Thomas Hamilton and the police officer concerned would appear potentially suspect, consequently requires Her Majesty's government to institute at the earliest date the most urgent independent an exhaustive inquiry into those matters to ensure the open publication of the fullest report possible. The News of the World Investigates by 𝗲𝗏𝗱𝗍𝗍. Published December 28, 2003. The inquiry into the Dunblane massacre was a massive cover-up, a top Scots Freemason has sensationally claimed. Former Grand Master Lord Burton says that Lord Cullen's official probes suppressed crucial information to protect high-profile legal figures. He says they may belong to a secretive supermason group called the Speculative Society. Some had links to the Queen Victoria School, where gunman Thomas Hamilton was allowed to roam free before the 1996 atrocity, and Lord Burton revealed that he was bullied and threatened by other peers when he tried to raise his concerns in the House of Lords. Last night the 79-year-old aristocrat said, "There's no escaping the fact there's something sinister about the whole affair." He was prompted into action after reading in the News of the World last month that police are investigating claims that pupils at QVS were regularly taken away and sexually abused. The Cullen inquiry failed to investigate why suspected pedophile Hamilton was allowed to wander around the school whenever he liked, running camps and using the shooting range. Former Housemaster Glenn Harrison told us how he even found Hamilton, 43, creeping around the dormitories at night. He said Hamilton, who murdered 16 pupils and a teacher at Dunblane Primary School in 1996, had close links to a top cop. Glenn said he was aghast that he was never called to give evidence at the Cullen inquiry. He said, "I was one of the people who was making a fuss about Hamilton long before he killed those children, but no one wanted to listen." Now Lord Burton has contacted him at his new home in the Shetland Islands, saying he believes Glenn wasn't called to give evidence to avoid the embarrassment of top legal names being dragged into it. The QVS is for schoolchildren of the military services and has long-standing links to high office. Its current patron is the Duke of Edinburgh. Whoever holds the position of Secretary of State for Scotland becomes President, and Scotland's second most senior judge, the Lord Justice Clerk, becomes a Commissioner, Lord Burton said. "I was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland at the time, and I'm aware that most of the conspiracy theories around Dunblane revolve around allegations of a Masonic conspiracy. I do have some difficulty with that, but I have learned of an apparent connection between prominent members of the legal establishment involved in the inquiry, and the secretive Speculative Society. The society was formed in Edinburgh University through Masonic connections, so I accept that there might be a link by that route. But Hamilton was never a Mason. His grandfather was." Current members of the Speculative Society include Lord Cullen and a number of other judges, sheriffs and advocates. Lord Burton has been trying for years to get to the bottom of the conspiracy theories, using his influence in the House of Lords until the reforms meant he was no longer entitled to sit in Westminster. Last night he said, "I tried repeatedly to raise concerns about the inquiry during my time in the Lords, and I was bullied and threatened by powerful peers loyal to the Conservative government of the day, who warned me of dire consequences if I continued to embarrass them. But the determined peer pressed on, and in 1999, asked a question in the Lords which revealed that documents from the inquiry had been locked up for 100 years. Among them was a police report revealing that Hamilton had been accused of sexually abusing boys and had been considered by some officers unfit to hold a firearms license." Lord Burton added, "We still need to know why that was necessary. Who was the secrecy protecting? Although the official reason is to protect the families of possible abuse victims, it's unusual for documents to be locked up unless for matters of national security." In July, Dunblane ambulance worker Sandra Utley told the News of the World how she and friend Doreen Hager had drawn up a 50,500-word dossier calling for secrecy surrounding the tragedy to be lifted. They claimed that dozens of questions have gone unanswered and crucial lines of inquiry were ignored. Former ambulance worker Sandra said, "There may be other individuals who should face prosecution." Glenn Harrison had kept dozens of files from pupils alleging bullying and abuse while he was at the QVS, and wrote to parents warning of the dangers in 1991. It led to him being ousted from the school, and just days before he left, police raided his home and confiscated the files. When Glenn read Sandra's story, he went back to the police, and this time they agreed to investigate. Last night he said he in turn had been glad to receive the call from Lord Burton. He added, I've been making noises for years and I sometimes despair and think it's time to just accept we'll never get to the truth. But I think we owe it to all the people who were so affected by the killings to continue to demand questions that were never asked. Glenn told us that Hamilton had been a friend of Ben Phillip, the senior housemaster at QVS. Mr. Phillip died in December 1993, aged 46, when he fell from a ladder while hanging decorations. Glenn said, "They were friends, so Hamilton was a regular visitor to the school and I was introduced to him. Ben Phillip was a decent guy who was very trusting. I think he thought he and Hamilton shared interests in things like the outdoors, and he couldn't see that Hamilton had another motive for wanting to be around the school. Hamilton ran camps in the school grounds and he used the shooting range freely. He came and went as he pleased, almost as if he owned the place, and no one has ever tried to explain why he had such freedom. I am still haunted by the memory of picking up my newspaper on March 14, 1996, and reading about what had occurred at Dunblane Primary School the day before. I just knew the killer had to be Thomas Hamilton. He should have been stopped." Thomas Hamilton harbored a long-standing grievance against the Scouts and the police. In the large volume of correspondence which he generated, a recurring theme is his assertion that the police were biased in favor of the Brotherhood of Masons and that there was a brotherhood link between the Scouts and the police. In passing, it may be noted that this, together with evidence given by Mr. Duchars, indicated that Thomas Hamilton had never been a Freemason. I am satisfied that he was not a member of the Masons. Evidence was given by a number of his acquaintances of his bitter complaints of having been victimized by the police and having suffered hard treatment at the hands of local authorities. When Mr. W. B. McFarlane met him from time to time during the last 7 or 8 years of his life, he found that Thomas Hamilton's conversation was all one way. He was anti-police, he was anti-establishment, he was anti-the education authority. He seemed to be anti-anybody who opposed his views on how the clubs should be run, or whether they should be run. Thomas Hamilton knew that he was being referred to as a pervert, and thought that teachers and parents had been discouraging boys from attending his clubs. He told an acquaintance that, if he stopped running the clubs, people would have considered that rumors about him were true. Abuse Probe School has links to Dunblane Killer. By Marcelo Mega. Police are probing claims that boys were sexually abused at a military school linked to Dunblane killer Thomas Hamilton. The allegations concern Stirlingshire's Queen Victoria School, which boasts Prince Philip as its patron. They came from a former housemaster who says pupils were regularly preyed on by a vice ring of toffs. The pervs, some of them major establishment names and close pals with Hamilton, allegedly picked up their victims in flash limos and dropped them off the next day, obviously distressed. But, says Glenn Harrison, the military code at the Dunblane school meant the kids kept quiet about their ordeal. The full horror emerged when some of the victims broke down and told him their sickening tales of sustained sexual abuse. Glenn says one boy was so seriously assaulted in one overnight orgy that he later tried to kill himself. His claims, now being investigated by Central Scotland cops, could embarrass the original inquiry led by Lord Cullen. Scotland's top judge heard how 43-year-old Hamilton killed 16 pupils and a teacher at Dunblane Primary in 1996. 3 witnesses told of the disgraced scoutmaster's links with the QVS, including organizing camping trips for pupils. But Glenn says he was never called to give his inside info, even though he'd approached the authorities several times. In his written statement to the police, Glenn, who now lives on the Shetland Isle of UNST, says, "My allegations were never investigated. They never interviewed me. I did not exist." Campaigners say the original probe ignored the QVS's links with some of the biggest names in the Scottish judiciary. Central CID said last night, "We will shortly decide what action is required."